The next panel is going to tackle a very important topic, which is strategic planning for 2026. It is strategic planning season because we are in November for every corporation. And so how should we be factoring AI into our corporate strategic plans? And then how should we be factoring it into our departmental plans? And one of the nuggets from the Wharton report was that 30% of generative AI technology budgets are allocated to internal R&D. So this panel will be discussing, is that the right allocation? How should we be thinking about it? What should that look like? And give you some inputs into your thought process for getting prepared for your own strategic planning process. And this panel will be moderated by Talullah Le Merle.
Great, thank you. And I believe we have Steve joining again, right? I saw Steve on the last panel is double timing on ours as well. But we can get started while we're waiting for him to join. I have Paul and Nikesh with me. So yes, as Christina mentioned, and I believe this is the last panel of the day, but it should be a great one because we're translating strategy into action and hopefully making this very real for our audience in terms of tactically how to embed AI into 2026 planning, into budgets, talking metrics, KPIs, and all these sorts of things. So Paul and Nikesh, I'm going to let you guys introduce yourselves. I know all of our panelists, and hopefully Steve is joining back, have a lot of combined experience working with corporates on translating AI into real value for the organization. And Nikesh, you have a really unique viewpoint as well in the work you were doing. So I'll let you guys introduce yourselves. Maybe we do 1 minute, highlight what you're working on now, how it pertains to this discussion we'll be having around 2026 business planning. Paul, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. Thanks. And Nikesh, nice to meet you. My name's Paul Byer. I'm a founder of a startup called GAI Insights, and we are an analyst firm focused on Gen AI, helping companies transform. We work closely with Harvard Business School. Both my co-founder and I were just recently reappointed as Harvard Business Fellows on AI, and really working a lot of PE firms and leading companies right in this planning cycle. So this is a really important topic, particularly given how fast things are changing.
Great. Nikesh?
Hi, thanks again. Great to meet you, see both of you, and also thanks to everyone in the audience. My name is Nikesh Kocha. I run data science for Stanford Healthcare. So we're a health system here in the Bay Area, and really trying to think about how do we get these data science AI capabilities out for our clinicians, our staff, and ultimately to our patients. Like, how do we do that, and what makes sense as we go through?
Great. And we have Steve joining back. I said, Steve, I know you're on the last panel, so you're all warmed up.
I thought it was a different link. I apologize. I logged out and then suddenly realized it was the same link, and I'm like, no. So apologies.
Are you ready to talk about strategic business planning with AI? Shift from the agenda?
Oh, yes, definitely. Definitely.
So do you want to reintroduce yourself in case people are just joining for this panel session?
Steve Jones, EVP Data. Yeah. Steve Jones, EVP Data and Business for the last 5 years, focusing on a simple question, which is, if 50% of business decisions are made by AI, what does the business look like? So that's my job.
Yep. And I think many in the audience are, well, from corporate and enterprise backgrounds, have been asking themselves that same question. So I'll start off. The first question is pretty broad, moving from strategy to action. And it's really, in these strategic business planning sessions for 2026, where should AI be in that conversation at the executive level? But also if we think about for specific functions across the organization, how different heads of, say, finance or HR versus product versus sales are thinking about what this means for them. What are your thoughts on that? Strategic planning at the executive level, but also in functions across the organization. And I don't mind who starts. I'm hoping this is just a fluid dialogue.
I can start. I'll make a statement, which is, if you're not doing AI from the board level down, then you're doing a technology program, and the best you're going to do is fragmented implementation, because ultimately, to really do this successfully, it is a strategic change in the people side. When we talk people, process, technology, the impact of AI is much, much more on the people and organizational side than it is on the process and technology. It isn't a technology impacting process upwards. It's a concept of actually, how am I changing the way I do my business downwards? So from my experience working with companies where they've had board sponsorship and companies where they haven't had board sponsorship, I will say consistently the failure rates, the pieces we've seen from the MIT report, for instance,
Yeah.
Those companies that don't have that executive downwards direction and don't understand why as a business they're looking at this don't achieve successful sustained use of AI. So it has to start at the executive level.
Other thoughts,
Yeah,
Nikesh? Yeah.
yeah, I'll echo that. I think we've been pretty fortunate in that we have a lot of leadership support, and that's where the push is coming from, which is great, and that's what you need. In prior eras of technology, right, you're usually trying to convince the upper management that something needs to happen. In this case, I think it's actually been the opposite.
Yep.
That has its own challenges as well, but it's a good thing because you really are not going to be able to do it just as a technology budget or just from a technology perspective. You have to bring the entire organization along, and for that, you need the top level support.
Yeah. I just add for some of our research, I think it's segmented by industry a little differently. We've got introduced a framework called WINS, words, images, numbers, sounds, little 2x2 that we had published. And some industries we call in the Crucible, and that's where they're seeing 5 to 15% of revenue and profit impact next year. Insurance companies, professional services companies, and entertainment companies. Other companies, mining companies, these guys can wait a little bit here. And we're certainly seeing the companies are in the Crucible spending more than $5 to $10 million a year. Careers are on the line. Executives are pushing. We have both PE firms and private equity, public firms looking at valuation premiums from 5 to 15% if you can prove you're an AI first leader in your peer group. And that's something that needs to be taken into account in the budget cycle. And we see the vast majority of boards, unless they're really being pushed hard by the PE firms, do not yet fully understand this.
Yep. And one of you mentioned it's a tale as old as time with technology, that they leave it to the remit of, say, the technology function, and then it becomes this very fragmented effort. Whereas this is something that obviously corporates are using it to transform themselves and take out cost and improve efficiency, but there's also so much top line growth potential as well to be had here, whether it's in sales and agentic in sales, for example, which was discussed earlier in this conference. But I want to, Steve, you mentioned the infamous MIT article, which everyone cites, enterprise AI, about 90% of organizations not getting the value they'd expect from the investments they're making, they're ring fencing millions to AI. So this is obviously an issue. I think on the one hand, it's difficult to measure ROI when it comes to augmentation of work, which is largely the case here. But what are your guys' thoughts on this? And because we're talking as concrete as possible here, are there specific metrics or KPIs that you think execs should be showing their board every month, or that they should be getting behind to demonstrate whether it's working or not?
I think the first piece on the metrics is first to be clear on what are the metrics you're actually impacting. The MIT report was really interesting in terms of a lot of it came over us. We didn't really know what we were building, and therefore it failed. Yeah, okay. Duh. That's why one of the things that the CapGemini that we in my area we banned last year, we banned doing POCs, and the reason we banned doing POCs was you can always prove, particularly with Gen AI, that it'll work theoretically. The problem is, will it work in production? So if you can't demonstrate who in the business is going to manage it, what's the actual metric that determines success, why are you even starting the program? Well, you can go to ChatGPT now and say, create me a GPT that makes it look like it can optimize a mining explosion run, right? Yeah, great. And it'll fake out something and you go, oh, there we go, I've done it with Gen AI. The difference between that and plugging it into a mine that's in the west coast of Australia that can actually optimize these things is a completely different challenge. So there should absolutely be metrics which are impacted by AI that you can prove you are improving through the use of AI. And I'll give you a slightly silly, not a silly story, but to bring it to, I worked on a project that was a failure from a metrics perspective. It actually put 20 plus agents collaborating together into production. It is still running today, but stated goal was that they would reduce the number of people in the call center by over 1,000, nearly 2,000 people. Not a single person was got rid of at the end of it. That didn't, but here was the reason. What the person who ran that business area did went, well, I can now use those people to do cross-sell, upsell, and do some more proactive things on our high value accounts, and I can drive a whole new set of revenue that more than justifies those 1,500 people. So I'm not going to get rid of them. What our metric should have been was the call deflection one and the NPS one, and it should have been the accuracy response. But everybody was focused on, I would say, a high level quote business metric, but it wasn't what AI could actually impact. So there absolutely should be within a business metrics that people are reporting on that they can actually impact with AI. And today, most of those actual metrics live in people's heads. So one of the big problems in terms of success is You don't align it to the business structure, which is where metrics surface, and you don't create the metrics which are aligned to actually the thing that AI impacts. So you're only reporting on secondary elements, which the business understandably goes, well, you can't actually prove that you impacted that. So for instance, my program, very successful, but we didn't get rid of enemies in the call center. And the reason was because we're not responsible for hiring and firing in the call center. So why was that our metric when we started on the project? We made a mistake. We were successful technologically. The project is considered wildly successful from a business perspective now. But if I was go back and look at it from the metric perspective, and I've been reporting that metric to the board, people would have gone, well, you failed. And that, I think, is a salutary lesson for me. That was early this year, of really looking at the metrics that the AI can impact and reporting those, not just taking the high level KPIs and pretending that AI impacts them.
Paul, I see you coming off mute.
Yeah, no, I think, we get a simple 4-stage maturity model here. And I think so many companies that Steve were talking about are in that we call islands of experimentations or islands of automation, that POC. And so few of those go over the big gulf to the third stage, which is really the kind of synchronized at scale projects we're seeing out there. And I know that the MIT report's got a lot of coverage here. I know that we're certainly suspect of some of the methodology we could talk about, but reality is that companies are spending millions on this. Reality is that PwC and others have come out and said they're going to hire a third less college graduates because of AI. So many executives are seeing a real ROI in here. So I think they say there's no ROI in general, I think is not representative of the investment level out there. But I think how you get that, I think that what Steve's saying is really important on realizing this is just an accelerant to your digital transformation projects. And I think to steal Scott Galloway's term, I think there really is an Ozempic moment here for corporate. Usually corporations, you have 10% more revenue, you need 5% more people. And if you want 10% less revenue, you need less 10%. We're seeing companies that are increasing revenue and cutting people, and certainly hyperscalers going into next year. And I think we're going to see that in other industries here. So we really are at a profound moment here in terms of 2026 planning that Wall Street is paying attention to, private equity advisors are paying attention to, and CFOs are not letting people get new hires replaced unless you can prove that work can be done and not be done by an AI. So it really is a new era that we're living here, and we're seeing it through the budgeting cycle.
Yeah. Nikesh, anything to add from what you guys are deploying actively?
Yeah, no, these are both really great examples. I really like both what Paul has to say and what Steve did with his metrics. I think I absolutely agree. I think there are financial pressures coming, at least for the health industry for sure, that are also like driving it, right? For the first time, as we think about our margins going lower, how are we going to do all the work we need to do with the same amount of people or the same capacity of ability? What does that mean? Has definitely helped in terms of trying to think about how do we align our metrics. I think the interesting thing about metrics, Paul's example, Steve's example is really great, is are we measuring the right things? And I think we're in a kind of a different stage. So I think maybe a year or two ago, it was a lot of, does this thing even work? What should we be looking at? And how can we see what's going on? And we saw a lot, and we still see it a lot. Like you hear a lot about time-saving metrics. I save time here, and that's going to translate into lots of productivity. And what we know for sure is it's great that you're saving time, but it's not necessarily time save 3 minutes here and there is not necessarily going to mean you're going to be 30 times more productive. You have to have it be in a batch setup to be able to get there. And so it's coming back down to, am I actually improving my throughput or capacity? And how do I think about that and bring that metric into play in the right way? And I don't know if we're there yet in terms of how best to articulate that for our health system, but that is certainly something we think a lot about. And then also just getting to this point where when you have leadership buy-in, you can have a shared language around what should we be measuring? How do we measure the right things? Are we aligned on what the metrics we're going to look at and the actions are going to be after that? And the final thing I think we hear, at least we try and talk a lot, but I don't hear a lot, is it's great to define a project, have a metric, but then are we following up and actually seeing if we're hitting those metrics? And if not, are we actually turning things off? I don't think that's the hardest thing in a large organization is to turn something off.
To kill things.
That I still think is a big challenge in the organization.
Yeah.
One thing, if I may, if I were to relate to I'm interested in, Steve, your viewpoint. The thing we could see out there is even if you have the metrics right and the technology, still less than 10% of CEOs understand this AI moment and lead. And as soon as you have a CEO who's not leading, It drops down the organization. It floats over this IT organization. They're wasting $100,000, $200,000 over there. So for me, the scarcity is not even the right metric. The scarcity is the right alignment of leadership that's understanding that they need to treat this as a capability, not a technology, and not just have this a checkbox item for a bunch of POCs. And regardless of that, Steve, I don't know how any project's going to be successful next year. And companies need to be shorted that aren't realizing this right now in some sectors.
I completely agree, because and one of the things this year is it's once every 2 to 3 weeks I'm doing a board presentation, exec or non-exec. And I will say, in all my career in technology, in the last 12 months, 12, 18 months, I've done more board presentations than I did in the entire rest of my career, because it's part of this education, getting people on board and explaining the scale of the challenge. And I do think part of the problem of scaling the scale of challenge of CEOs is a lot of them remember the dot-com bubble and remember the hype and all that, and have remembered and have gone through being told Bitcoin and blockchain is going to change the world and metaverse is going to change the world. And guess what? You're a mining company. It didn't impact you at all. You're a retailer. What happened? Nothing. So there's an understandable skepticism. And I think that it's also not helped with the degree of hype that is also associated with AI. So you've got very practical companies. So a lot of my job these days is going to boards, speaking to boards, and basically saying, yes, the hype is nonsense. But let me explain the practicality. We were just talking on the previous panel, like one of the pieces of practicality is this myth that, oh, you've got to use these great big models. The only way you can get a value is these great big models, because that's what drives their valuations. In most businesses today, the thing the CEO should be asking is, what's the smallest model we can get away with to solve these problems? What's the smallest thing, if we can well describe our business, that's going to make it right? So I completely agree with you, Paul. If the CEOs aren't engaged, if the board isn't engaged, you're just going to be throwing stuff at the wall and seeing what sticks, and it will not be successful. So your number one thing should be, how do you scare the board? How do you scare deliberately? How do you scare them into realizing, yes, the hype is nonsense, but that doesn't mean it's real? And the analogy I had is, I spoke to a very famous retailer in 2003 who told me e-commerce absolutely isn't a major strategy for us. The dot-com bubble happened. We're not worried about it. I will say that the building I was in is no longer associated with the company that I met, and they are no longer in business. So it's something that's the thing you need to do, is get the boards realizing that this is an existential threat, but not in the way that necessarily the great and the good of Silicon Valley are saying. It's real, but it's not magic.
Yeah. I actually want to continue along this line, because along the same, we talked about leadership not being aligned and it not coming from top down, but I feel another big fall down point is, again, the fear within the organization that this is just replacing jobs, that we know that it will. Right now we're at the stage of augmentation, but this will create entirely new career ladders and entirely new industries and opportunities. But bringing the organization along that understanding can be difficult. So when it comes to people and change, what thoughts do you have on that? Again, being as tactical as we can, and maybe even translating, if we're thinking of AI as a capability, what capabilities is it providing? And then what type of roles and skills you need to think about building in the organization to support that?
Yeah, so I can go first.
Do you want to start, Nikesh? Yeah,
Yep.
go for it.
Yeah,
No,
I
you
think,
go.
sorry. I think it is a critical thing, and it's almost about over communicating, right? I think the piece that you have to make sure is these capabilities are available. Like, they might be using them at home. If they're using them at home, can they use them at work? And do they know some fundamentals, some basics on what is there, right? So we've spent a fair amount of time just trying to figure out what exactly do we need to tell and how do we get that out. We've rolled out enterprise-wide training. We've tried to put pieces in like different levels. Managers need to know more versus like our individual contributors. And then just fundamentally trying to understand where the organization is at, right? So where we sit, we get a really interesting viewpoint. When I look on the university side, it is incredible, all the work that's going on, and every minute there's a new research paper that's happening. When I look at what we need to do operationally, we're probably like 5-6 years behind still, right? And like the skill gap is real, and it's not a skill gap, it's a knowledge gap, right? And kind of understanding what is possible to do and how they can think about it differently. And we spend a lot of time just trying to go to different groups within the organizations to just have these conversations so they can understand what is possible and what's coming, right? The other thing I keep telling my team is you can't expect them to come to you with requirements because these technologies didn't even exist 2 years ago. They're not going to know what the requirements. I can't ask a nurse, what are you going to do with a language model? They don't even know what a language model is. So we've got to be able to come with some understanding of what the problem is and help like bridge that gap and make sure they understand the types of things that can work. So we spend a lot of time doing that.
Yeah, just Steve, as your point as well. I'm actually a little tired of the fear thing here. I think it's time to adapt. This is not 2023. This thing is moving really fast. We're looking at probably 10 to 15 million white collar workers earn over $100,000 going to get laid off in the next 24 months here. Anybody with kids in college are asking about this. 20% of HBS grads last year couldn't get jobs because investment banking and consulting are hiring less positions here. The college graduates coming out here are going to have a brutal time getting jobs, entry-level jobs next year. Your best talent knows this. So we encourage, at least I encourage executives, let's be real. Your top talent knows this is the biggest career accelerant ever. They want to learn this. They want to be a part of companies that are helping them be an AI first company so they can also go home because they're helping their kids with this here. You didn't hire stupid employees. So they know that augmentation does mean that a team of 5 probably only need a team of 3 next year. So I think you do need to be realistic with them, and maybe there's reskilling, and maybe it's positioned as less drudgery work and less hiring going forward. But I think it's realistic. I think it's naive to talk about too much of the fear. There's a hurricane is starting to come into Miami now, and it's now to start trying to stop being afraid of the hurricane and start adjusting and getting off that beach and getting out of Miami.
And I just add on this is that it's totally human that we fear the unknown, but we're like work for us used to mean subsistence activities. We're hunter gatherers. That's changed over the timeline of human evolution, but also everyone underestimates inertia. And when you work with these large corporates, you know how things are relatively gradual. And the Goldman Sachs estimates that the peak unemployment effect will only be 0.5 points, which compared to COVID, I think was 11 points because it was a complete furlough, almost overnight moment. And then the last recession was 5.5 points or something like this. So compared to that, relatively gradual, and that's forgotten in this. And also the opportunity for hybrid human AI roles and new career ladders, as we say, the latest World Economic Forum report suggests there's more than double the amount of jobs will be created by 2030 than get replaced. But there's always over focus on what we know and what we love that we may lose. Any thoughts, Steve and Nikesh, on this? Yeah.
I think you're right. The piece I'll say is that still doesn't mean the net effect might be 0.5, but that doesn't mean that the gross effect won't be very significant. And that's the challenge. So that to me is the piece is what does your business, that's why the thing I say about my role is what does your business look like if half of your decisions are taken by AI? How are you running it? How are you managing it? What different things are we doing? I'll give you a scenario I've spoke to a few retailers and CPG companies about and not implemented yet, but thinking about from a business strategy perspective. Today, things like VMI and TPM don't really exist, and TPM exists, trade promotion management, but it's done externally and it's very systolic and schedule it and all those pieces. Now imagine a world in which a CPG company can deploy agents into a retailer to have active views on stock and foot traffic and all of those things, leak none of that information back to the parent company and be able to do active TPM and active VMI inside the firewalls of the retailer. I'm suddenly running my retailer completely differently and my CPG has a completely different level of challenge. That will 100% require new jobs. The analogy that I use is that the website I built for a very large company in 2000, I could build in a weekend today, and yet somehow they've got 1,000 people in their e-commerce department. That level of shift is undoubtedly going to happen, and there absolutely, I believe, will be new jobs and new careers. That doesn't mean that they're the same careers as they are today. And I think that to me is when I'm looking at it from a shift perspective is the question is going to be in a much more connected, agent-driven world, how do you retain relevance as a business is going to be a bigger challenge. And I think that is the sort of piece from a board perspective is what is your strategy for a world in which the interactional model with consumers, the interactional model with businesses, this interaction model with all of your partners is going to change, or how are you still relevant in that world? So I think the scale of change is huge, but yes, I think there'll be more jobs afterwards.
I think the big thing there, though, is how do we think about organizational components, right? So it's one thing to say that's what's going to happen and get the board correct to do that. I think that's absolutely critical. But then there's this really human component to like, how do you do it for a large organization, especially? If you're a smaller company and it's 5 or 10 people and you're trying to think of how to shift them, that can happen. You can see that. When talking about 1,000 or 10,000 people, it's a journey, and I don't know what the right answer is, right? We had the same conversation. We keep saying, look, the academic medical center is going to look different 5 years from now. What people are going to come to the doctor for is going to be very different. How do we think about that, and what does that actually mean? Even if we can articulate that, which we can't yet, getting the organization to do that, I think, is the other big thing that is going to be a challenge over this next couple of years.
Okay, one of the things we're finding that's being helpful is to find just one department that's stepping forward and really lean into those managers and directors who are Gen AI enthusiasts. So maybe it's customer service is stepping forward or marketing step forward. So inside the organization that uses the organizational language and processes, you can at least start seeing the real use cases here. And one of the things that we really encourage companies is to really continue to look at zero risk cases, that use cases, zero risk projects that are less than $10,000. Doing no code LLMs for your website with public data is a no-brainer. That doesn't require any technical thing, yet less than 0.001% of websites even have that today, and that can be done with 15 different products out there. And that's a great way to start getting the organization more familiar with things like this. And I think, and going back and giving them hope, I think part of the fear comes with, I'm against a wall, I don't know what it looks like, versus getting a little bit of training and being able to point to a project that make a lot of sense.
Yeah. So it's like improve literacy. So they're starting from a baseline of common understanding. I love the idea of change champions within different functions, because they can also then translate from that top down strategy what it means by function, and then improve with adoption, which is, when it comes to ROI, it's another reason. It's more about issues with the deployment and getting adoption and usage than the promise of the technology itself. So I know we only have kind of 5 minutes left. I have one more question I want to ask you guys, whether, and Nikesh, in your experience of deploying, and Paul and Steve looking at this from an advisory lens, is about responsible AI and how much corporates are considering how to adopt this with the right guardrails and privacy, security, and how much they're thinking about that and what they should be considering when choosing a tool or suite of tools that's going to work for them.
Yeah.
I mean, I'll just do it. Hang on for my keynote. That's exactly what I'm talking about next. So around the idea of the AI resource management, and if you have a digital workforce, how do you manage a digital workforce? So I think Jensen Huang put it really quite well in January at CES, which was, the future of IT is to be the HR of agents. That's the mentality you need to start having in terms of responsible AI. What is the HR function? Because they're not there to make employees happy, and the HR for AI agents isn't there to make the AI agents happy either. It is about responsibility, trust, compliance, and all of those things. So hang on for a bit.
Like a lot of things, it's like security. I mean, these are trade-offs. Are we going to delay a project 1.5 years to make sure we get every ethical concern and bias out of the data, that we triple check everything? I think the reality is that these projects do need to go live. They need to be within our existing framework of security and compliance and everything else in here. But this isn't any different than any other risk management item that the company's been managing for the last 30 years. At the end of the day, something's got to ship at some point here. So that's a trade-off decision.
Right. And safety traditionally lags behind innovation, right? So with the sense that it will catch up.
I think here the culture of the organization also does come into play, right? So I think it's been like, at a health system especially, right? Like, safety is paramount. Like, you are not going to try and do things in a way that's not safe, or like you haven't done enough validation. And if you want to bring that group of the organization along, which you eventually will need to, you have to show them how you're doing it and what a framework looks like. Now, that framework does not need to be onerous, and you don't need to like make it really crazy, but you do need to have thought behind it and be able to say, look, this is how we're approaching it. This is what the field is saying. And these are some unsolved problems that we're still working through, but here's our approach to get to them, right? And that's been a lot of like organizational work we've done. And again, leadership support really helps to say, here's our evaluation framework, here's how we think about assessments. But then, to Paul's point, we take a risk-based approach, right? You're not going to do this for everything. You try and figure out what parts make sense and what parts don't. And then you try and get a shared language across the organization, which, again, that's always an ongoing conversation, right? Because like different people have different meanings on risk, but you just be practical about it and move things forward. And I think that's pretty important to do.
Yep. Great. So we have 1 minute left, and I have a quick, like a 3-pronged closeout question for you guys, which is for our enterprise and corporate audience. What one thing would you suggest they stop doing that they're doing now when it comes to AI deployment or planning for next year? What would you suggest they start? And an optional do more of, which is something they're already doing, which they can double down on to be successful. And we'll start. Why don't Nikesh, will start with you. Stop, start, do more of.
Okay,
It's like red light, green light, yellow light.
yeah, so I think stop going and playing with every day there's a new AI solution coming out. Like you can spend all your time, I do that. There's way too many. So there's more for me than everyone else. But I guess stop doing that. There's pick a couple. These things are getting really good. Like you'll get more value out of sticking to 3 or 4 versus trying to learn 20. And then I think start thinking about the problem and the workflow more so than the technology component of this. At the end of the day, these things only help if you can get the workflows and get the problem solved. I think that's the biggest piece around this. And then do more of, I think, if learning anything, it's the evaluation component, which I can't think came up in the last panel as well, is understand how you evaluate these things that are really important to understand.
Yep. Great. Steve?
Stop doing POCs. Already banned them at our place to definitely do that. Number 2, in terms of start designing your digital employees. Start designing how your business wants to view AI and to manage AI. And third, double down on industrialization and include evaluations in those. Is to the point that new technology is coming along, industrialize everything that isn't in the build area, because everything else is going to be much more consistent. Double down on industrialization.
Great. And Paul, bring us home.
Yeah, so stop being fearful and leading into the fear. Do more of understanding this is a capability. Learning is the new oil. You've got to lean into that. And then what you specifically do more is you personally commit to, and I'm saying this, most executives still don't do this. Executives personally commit to using either Copilot or Microsoft GPT. Those are only 2 secure chatbots that 99% of organizations use at least 5 hours a week. And constantly ask yourselves, what's the robots doing? Become an exemplar of an experiential learner as a leader. And that's a very different approach than a lot of the other leaders are taking.
Thank you, guys. I think that we had a great discussion, making that very concrete, bridging from strategy into action. And here's Christina to usher us into the next session. So thank you all.
Thank you, Talullah. That was great. You did a wonderful job. Thank you all for sharing your wisdom. I think everyone is in better shape for doing their strategic planning than they were before they listened to this panel.